Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is the Darklight Emissary, and for today's video, I want to cover the return of the Primarch Fulgrim, back to the 40k era officially, and what this could mean for the lore, what it already has impacted, and what it could impact moving forward. For those of you newer to the setting, you probably are familiar with Primarchs as Sons of the Emperor, leaders of the Space Marine Legions, and in ancient times, part of the Great Crusade and subsequent Horus Heresy era. But I will give a more full history of Fulgrim up to the modern era here, for a refresher for all of you. Fulgrim was one of these Primarchs, and he was lord over the Emperor's Children Legion, which was unique amongst the legions for being allowed to carry the Emperor's personal heraldry on their armor and iconography. To make a long story short, Fulgrim, along with his legion during the Great Crusade, were considered one of the upper tier legions, I would say. And during that era fought a species of alien known as the Realanor during their third compliance, which were serpentine beings that came in many different mutations and forms from their own sciences, and unbeknownst to the Legion at the time, likely chaos mutations as well. Not without considerable effort, but with a lot of skill and dedication, they were defeated by Fulgrim's forces, and Fulgrim took from one of their temples a magnificent silvered blade. As it turns out, this species of Xenos were worshippers of the chaos god Slaanesh, and taking that blade sent Fulgrim down a cursed path to eventually become a demon prince of the god of excess. Living in the blade was a greater demon of the dark prince. And through tempting whispers and influence, over time compromised Fulgrim's mind to the point he was eventually possessed for a time by this demon. Slaanesh is a fickle being, a fickle god. Out of all of the four, she who thirsts is constantly bored of one focus and moving on to the next thing to be interested in. And like their god, the Emperor's Children Legion and their Primarch were much the same during the Horus Heresy. They were some of the hardest to keep on track or control by Horus to help fight the Emperor and the Loyalists. If you could get their attention, they were still a formidable legion, and Fulgrim himself was still a consummately masterful swordsman. It still eventually took Lorgar and one of his chief sorcerers to bind Fulgrim by his true demon name to force him to leave the realms of Slaanesh and participate in the siege. And for a time, Fulgrim and his forces were engaged fully in the siege, and they were making some decent progress at a portion of one of the walls protecting the palace. Rogal Dorn confronted his fallen brother atop one of these walls, and their conflict was brief, for Fulgrim seemed to not have it in him to really care about the conflict or fight his brother, which he had been essentially dragged into to begin with. Also, by this time, Lorgar was not present, and the sorcerer who had bound Fulgrim was dead, and so Fulgrim elected to leave the siege since he seemed to have grown bored of the conflict and was no longer bound there by anyone. He and his legion essentially immediately left the siege at that point. And this was, if I am correct, the last time Fulgrim was ever seen choosing to still take his normal Primarch body form when facing Dorn. And I didn't think until this moment during the siege that it was possible for the fallen Primarchs to take their normal Primarch forms at all. So this was an interesting thing to see Fulgrim choose. He had by now become a full demon prince, and his warp form was essentially a serpentine body in similitude, it seems, to the Realanor that were the beginnings of his fall to chaos to begin with. Fulgrim morphed into this form and then stepped through a portal on that wall, and he was not seen again, along with the bulk of his legion, until nearly 100 years from this point, during the Scouring era and presumably near the official end of that era itself. This next time that he was seen was known as the Battle of Thessala, which saw the Primarch Robot Guilliman, along with his Ultramarines and several successor chapters, now that legions were no more, fighting with Fulgrim and his legion, which had been rampaging across sectors for decades, likely at this point, in wanton destruction and gluttony, as befits a legion enthralled to the god of excess. This was likely the first and only time that Robot Guilliman witnessed seeing his brother in his new and terrible form. While Fulgrim may have essentially lost his soul and anything good left to him, he seemed to have not lost any of his skill with blades, and he now had 4 arms he could equip himself with a myriad of weapons. He fairly quickly dispatched Robot, slicing him across his neck and slicing an old wound open dealt to him during the heresy, and it sent Guilliman into stasis, not to return for the next 10,000 years, essentially. Due to the unexpected silver lining of the situation, being Fulgrim's obvious lack of ability to now focus for more than single moments on something, after Robot was defeated, his men were allowed to take him away, and Fulgrim presumably at this point took his legion with him into the Eye of Terror. At this point, the Legion, along with their Primarch, seemed to disappear largely from Imperial history until the current 41st millennium, with more frequency. Other than the odd remnant warband of the Legion raiding for slaves, or joining up with one of Abaddon's Black Crusades, nothing was really heard from this Legion for a time. As far as we know, one of the only outings Fulgrim had in this era was to revisit Isfahan III, after learning about a curious signal coming from that blasted ruin and monument to the sins of the distant past. There, Fulgrim found the assumedly last loyalist son of his legion, the Ancient of Rites, Rylanor, in the depths of the former palace that once stood in the capital city on this world. After some mocking and self-aggrandizement, Fulgrim essentially tried to tempt his last loyal son to join him, twist him into some new and corrupted warp-formed body. To answer this offense, Rylanor detonated a virus bomb that had been left from that earlier era. This bomb killed Rylanor, and while it could not kill a demon prince, it may have done worse than that, at least to Fulgrim. It wounded his pride, perhaps permanently leaving a scar, which is more than Rylanor could have ever hoped for in such a desperate gambit. And it is possible, in my opinion, that part of the change in appearance between Fulgrim back then when he was first a demon prince and then now, that it may be in part a permanent mark of malice or hatred that Fulgrim feels towards that event. Perhaps it had such an impact on his ego that it affected the way he looks now forever. I would like to hope that Rylanor got that kind of permanent damage done to such an insufferable being. It would be interesting that, some of the hatred that is now on Fulgrim's face, whereas before his appearance was a little more magnificent in a sense. You're going to see the artwork in this video, but his older model from the Heresy era looks a lot more princely, a lot more kind of glorious in effect, and now in the new model, in the new art, Fulgrim looks more corrupted, and it's kind of mentioned that this is because of the time spent in the warp, but I do wonder if it's not so much that as it is some kind of permanent mark of anger that Rylanor inflicted upon his very being, his very soul. And then, from presumably the early 30s millennia onwards, Fulgrim spent most of his time engrossed on his chosen homeworld in the warp, on a demon world called Calyx, which was named after his homeworld's capital city on Kamos. Meanwhile, Fulgrim's legion consumed itself, essentially, and broke up into numerous warbands, all pursuing their own cursed ways to worship their patron god in whatever ways they would see fit, often trying to one-up the Drukhari at their own game, with torture and enslaving anyone they could raid and find for their own just devious designs and pleasures that they want to inflict upon anyone they could get their hands on. It is said that being a prisoner to the Emperor's children is one of the worst fates that anyone can have in the setting, short of being imprisoned by the Drukhari themselves. Fulgrim seemed to not take much care or notice of anything his legion was doing, or any of his sons, and focused, as he was, on crafting his own world after old battles, seeking perfection in them, or getting bored and letting his crafted enemies win at times too. Thus is Fulgrim's fickle nature at this point. As befits the oddly beautiful but cursed realms of Slaanesh, Calyx is known for having oceans of pomegranate juice one day, and having it turn to oceans of blood the next. The forests and hills are described as roiling, rising and falling like waves. Just like its master, the planet itself seems unsure of and bored of its form from one second to the other, and changing it to the next to match its patron's desires and whims. As far as we know, this is where Fulgrim has stayed until the current era in the 42nd millennium, and seemingly some parts of the Emperor's Children Legion have come back together and are again assaulting Realspace in a united front, with beings like Lucius the Eternal and rumored sightings of the Primarch himself referenced possibly being together again. And then we got the new model, and artwork showing Fulgrim actively back, and he looks a fair bit different from how he looked at the end of the Heresy, as mentioned before, when he first took on the guise of his demonic form. And at least according to my observations, how Fulgrim looks likely changes day to day, even minute to minute at times. I imagine if you were to have the unfortunate opportunity to observe Fulgrim in person, his face, how he decorates himself, all of it would probably flux with whatever mood and desire he currently wished for. Likely, I would imagine this alone would drive you or any person insane to look on, and I don't think that the form we are presented with in the new model or art is meant to mean that Fulgrim's form is at all static. Likely, his weapons, form, anything about him changes often, as befits the often petty but many moods and desires of Slaanesh, and Fulgrim being an extension of such a being's will. Along with what I said about a possible side effect of Rylanor's vengeance being a factor as to the amount of kind of glory or enrapturing that Fulgrim does with his persona these days. A main theme of what I have told you so far is Fulgrim's main weakness or inhibition is his inability to stay focused on one thing for long, which makes me wonder what would motivate him to leave the endless pleasures and essential personal heaven he's made himself on Calyx. What would motivate Fulgrim to come back to the bloody and drab mortal realms? So far, what we do know is that Abaddon is not very happy with whatever Fulgrim has been up to, and seemingly is at odds with whatever master plans that Abaddon has had cooking. So whatever Fulgrim is up to, it is not on a united front with Chaos Undivided, nor seemingly related to the Black Crusade efforts by Abaddon and his forces. It may be possible he finally heard of Robout's return, and finds it a personal offense and affront that he did not end his brother so many millennia in the past, and wants to kill his brother out of personal pride and satisfaction that would bring him. It is possible that Fulgrim simply grew bored of even his own world, and wants to fight and test his skills with blades against mortals again, at least for a time. I highly doubt that Fulgrim's arrival back as active is for anything more than some personal vendetta or desire. He likely can still care less about any overall strategic goals. I do wonder if Fulgrim is going to wield the final Aeldari Crone Sword as a weapon. The sword needed to help bring about the rise of Reunited, the newest Aeldari god, and the being promised to defeat Slaanesh if it ever rises to full form in the warp. And that the Ynnari will let Robout and the Lion know, and they will have a huge campaign to stop the Emperor's children and whatever havoc they are causing in hopes of retrieving that blade directly from Fulgrim. It was last known that the final Crone Sword needed was deep in Slaanesh's own realm and personal palace. Only a being like Fulgrim would be allowed to retrieve such a blade and use it in such a selfish and flashy manner. And it would be very much in character for both Slaanesh and its servants to take such a risk simply for the thrill of possible failure as a way to inject some excitement into proceedings for themselves. I think that this is the main thing we may see. If so, this is going to be the next biggest shift in the main story for the current storyline in a while. As if the Ynnari are able to retrieve the sword, we may see a rise of a new god in the warp capable of contending with Slaanesh. Most factions in the galaxy would have an invested interest in seeing one of the Chaos Gods ended, so I can see this being a massive undertaking if that is being set up here, but only time will tell. I hope it isn't just Fulgrim rampaging around and being sent back to the warp after just a single fight like Angron or Martyrion was. I think that out of the 4 Chaos Primarchs that we know of and have seen be active, Fulgrim and Slaanesh are the most important for furthering the main story, at least as involving the Ynnari faction of Aeldari, which many fans of the Aeldari and the fandom have felt have been abandoned for some time now, especially with the Crone Blade seemingly out of reach in such an inhospitable place to retrieve it, like the literal palace of a Chaos God. And so, this is really what I have to say on this right now. What do you think? If you have a theory, leave a comment. I'd like to discuss them with you. The last video was very successful and we had a lot of discussion there, and so I hope we continue that trend here. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks for your time, and I hope you like, subscribe, and leave a comment to discuss the topic further. And I will look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Hope 2025 is starting off well for you, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.